We're here to talk about a recent piece that Daryl put into the Quadrant magazine and link below about China. Now, China is a big subject today. It's something we all need to come to grips with, the rising power and the effect that they'll have on world geopolitics. So, Daryl, what was it about, and what's the essence of your article, and what do we need to be mindful of?
Well, a couple of things. I looked at the relationship between Australia as in three phases. The first one being with communist China, 49 to 72, which was an interesting period of time when we didn't officially recognize communist China and had diplomatic relations with the Republic of China. And then there was that phase that went up to quite recently, where there was a feeling that all was going well, and what was good for China was good for us, and what was good for us was good for China, and China was moving in a sort of democratic, modern direction. And then over the last few years, that's turned around a bit. And might have to do with the current president of China, who's named himself President for Life, Xi Jinping. And so I think we're in a third phase. And my little insight is basically that I was there in 79, this period between Mao and the Zhong's faction taking power. And it's my understanding, and it always has been, and it's really run against what everyone else thinks, is that China remained a totalitarian society, and the so-called moderate faction of the Chinese Communist Party that rules China is as totalitarian-minded as the Maoists, who ran the Cultural Revolution and everything up until then. And in some cases, they're the very same people living in the same place, but we might call them Leninist capitalists rather than, the full-on Maoists. So that's sort of where I'm coming from.
Why, given the ideology of it all, why do they tolerate the profit motive and the personal enrichment angle of their recent embracing, certainly since the 1980s, and why do they run a social controls system that is Leninist? How can the two survive, and how can they reconcile the two, given their ideological, or what seems like inflexibility in many ways?
Yeah, and I think if you look back at Leninism in Soviet Union, you'll see in the period from 1921 to 28, where it's called the New Economic Period, where capitalism was encouraged. The market was allowed to exist, although under very strict terms. And when I describe it, you'll see what we're in here with China. That is, the banks remained under the control of the government. The whole export arrangements was under the control of the government. The secret police remained under the control of the government. And the army, the newspapers, the governance of the country all remained, and yet free market was able to exist. Now, strangely enough, not strangely enough, the same thing happened in China from 61, 62 up until the Cultural Revolution. And they also we call it the New Economic Period, where the same thing happened again, where certain market freedoms were allowed, and yet the higher domain was controlled by the government. So it's quite possible to allow for a degree of free markets and government control. I'll give you one example. For example, if you're rich in China from business, and a lot of them are in the top echelons of the party, that money is yours in one sense, but it can be taken away from you by the government at any moment. And you can't take that money. I think it's $50,000 a year. You can't take that money overseas with you. So the government remains in control ultimately, even though it seemingly allows the market system to exist. I imagine they think that, as people argued in the NEP, Nikolai Bukharin, that eventually this will lead to utopia. So Marxists have a mixed feeling towards capitalism. On one hand, they hate it. On the other hand, unlike the modern day lefty greenies, they see a role for industry and private enterprise historically.
Yeah, just a sort of quick history on China, I guess, for listeners. China's an ancient civilization, and like the big civilizations of the River Nile and Euphrates, there was a massive population and multiple crops per annum, which allowed sort of big congregations of populations. When you ever get population congregation like that, you get public service and various institutions that are developed. Something you wouldn't see in a more dispersed population. And China's really been well, what would you call it? Run by aristocrats and an emperor or a first citizen, and it's been run through pretty much to the present day. And the model, I guess, hasn't changed a whole lot. There have been various movements back and forth, but and they tend to have, as I sort of look at it over the centuries, they tend to have this sort of pressure cooker type effect where the ruling elite sort of hang on as the pressure builds, and then an external force comes in and reorders things, bit like the Manchus did, the Manchu dynasty, the last dynasty that the Chinese had, and so change happens at various levels, but not essentially. There's a lot of continuity in Chinese society. The way peasants lived 3,000 years ago, there's still people in those provinces, the rural provinces, are still living the same way today, pretty much as they would have then. So there's, and if we look at the communist oligarchy today, they're running things pretty much as an emperor would in the dynasty days, insisting on conformity of thought and legions of secret police and the like. I don't know how close I am to your view there, but so the Chinese Communist Party today is a representation of the emperors of previous eras. The same can be said to some extent, I guess, for Vladimir Putin in Russia, that it's not that different from the Tsars or the Communist Party heavies of the time. So there's that continuity. But the Chinese Empire and the Chinese people were once a great people, and when in the days when one worker would represent one unit of economic output, the Chinese, because of their large population, had the biggest economy in the world, along with India and those most populous nations. But from the time of the Industrial Revolution and before that the Agricultural Revolution, even Britain, with a population of 10 million, was producing more goods than China, the population nearly 200 million at the time. So the Industrial Revolution completely changed the economics and changed China from being the world's leading power on a not a per capita basis, but in an overall population critical mass basis, to being one of the poorest countries. And they're now recovering or attempting to recover from that, and to recover the prestige that they believe that they lost in that time. And the fact that from, say, the 1830s onwards, the Chinese referred to, it's taught in their schools today, the idea that it was the 100 years of humiliation when those barbaric, Quilo Westerners came in and humbled and shamed China, and it's taught that was an illegitimate removal of the Middle Kingdom from their centre of the universe position, and they're wanting to recover that. And some of their saber rattling, particularly around the South China Sea, is that unique for that Asian Chinese mentality, that unique demand for respect and to be held in esteem that they believe they lost in that time. So a great and ancient civilization is now wanting to be reborn, and that's having some effects. On the economic side of it, a lot of people seem to think that China is as a new economic powerhouse. But there's a couple of things to remember here. Firstly, a lot of the Western economies moved jobs to China. So China was just handed these jobs. They didn't have to compete for it or be the best or the most innovative. It was an international sort of financial decision to do that. And similarly, the workforce that China was able to pour into the factories were mainly illiterate peasants from the provinces, which they were able to, who were just subsistence farmers, and they could pour into the factories at $2 a day, and then they could control these people and keep wages artificially low. So again, it wasn't a market economy or anything like it, although there are some signs of that, more signs of it today. The Western idea was that China, once they engaged with the West, would ultimately become an open market economy with at least some levels of democratic representation, which to date hasn't really happened. And you touched on some of these things directly, indirectly, or most of those things in your article. So where do you see the situation now? Where do you see it going in the future, Darryl?
Well, it's interesting. I'll just pick on a few things that you said there. You're right, that democracy is not part of China's historical trajectory, and always this idea of a powerful leadership, very different from the West and other parts of the world, because the leaders often were bureaucratically based. That's how they got to the top. They weren't necessarily the big landowners, which turned into the Magna Carta and ideas of democracy, which is interesting. I see the problem, as you're putting it, twofold. On one hand, we are complicit in making China powerful, and it has for sure resurrected ideas of China as the center of the world. These are ideas that Mao had, by the way. He did squeeze nuclear weapon technology out of Khrushchev, and he did see himself as the as I think he saw himself as the heir to Stalin, but obviously the Russians didn't allow that to happen. But he was using Mao was using the communist bloc to push China back to its rightful place, as they see it, and now they've totally and utterly used America and the West to get what they want, and we have been complicit in that by, first of all, buying things from Kmart and so on and so forth, cheaply, made in China, made in terrible conditions. You mentioned the different salaries. In 1979, it was $30 a month people earned, and then it eventually became $30 a week. We are complicit in that. The big companies are complicit in that, in not having a loyalty to their own workers, because they're not the national bourgeoisie looking after the national workers anymore. They are the international bourgeoisie, transnational bourgeoisie, and as we've seen again and again, they're quite happy to work anywhere that maximizes their profits, including China. And even to this very day and into the future, they will insist upon, unless Trump and other people make it too hard for them, they will insist on doing business in China. We see it all the time in Australia. Australia was a manufacturing place, and I live in a city that was a manufacturing place, like a sort of an Australian version of parts of
Detroit
North.
or something like that.
Yeah, and I've spoken to people who are textile makers. Some of them, they're really heroic. They're the heroes in Australia, where they actually make things in Australia, sourcing from Australian wool, employing Australians, and trying to find a niche market when you can buy your socks very cheaply, made in China and elsewhere. Mind you, these socks I've found often develop holes in them very quickly, and maybe we'd be better off buying Australian products, which will last. So it's a multi frontal attack on everything. I mean, the globalists include business, They include government bureaucrats, this is in the West, and they include Wall Street, and on the left, they include everybody who doesn't want any borders and has no particular fondness for the local national companies. So this is a huge problem, and I think we've only just begun talking about it, possible solutions to it.
Oh, absolutely. It's going to play out for some years. The swiftness with which China's managed to accumulate vast sums of capital at the expense of the Western worker, and indeed their own workers. And this is being spent in.
Yeah, let's not forget they absolutely. I mean, the reason they're able to do this. I mean, if you go to China, in the big cities, in an ugly kind of way, look like big Western cities, but they don't have the planning authorities, etc., etc. But they have really ripped off their own workers, and yet it's complicated because I've been looking at the bullet trains, which are huge and fabulous business in China. I was watching, you can get down from Beijing to Hangzhou and back up to Beijing, in the same day and do some business in between. So there are lots of modern things happening in China, but it's not to do with democracy. It's not to do with people's participation in the running of the country. It is to do, as you said before, with basically really powerful people controlling a city, and that sort of mirrored, and then people controlling a province, people controlling a government. They all belong to the party. They're all vetted by the party. They all work for the party. Some of them are rich as well. Can you imagine the corruption going on there between business and government? And everybody is trapped, as I would say. They're trapped by a new Orwellian world that Mao could only dreamed of. Is they're all on WeChat, which is an interesting topic in itself.
Yes, it certainly is. There's a lot more discussions to be had about where China's going. One of the things that history, if anything, has taught us is when there's a rising power, or in the case of China, a resurging power undergoing some sort of resurgence or rebirth, is that they want to challenge the status quo, and they want to get respect. They want to be taken seriously and bow down to, and all sorts of things, or kowtowed in the Chinese parlance. But and we see throughout history the rise of Rome challenging the position of Carthage in the Mediterranean in the 280 and or even earlier BC. The rise of federated Germany challenging the status quo in the late 1800s, and there have been other examples throughout history. The rise of Britain in the early to mid 1700s, causing much consternation in Paris and so on, and Madrid and the like, and all of these things. As far back as you go in history, you see the same pattern, and it ultimately ends in some sort of disputation, which in turn spills over into armed conflict. And there are those who see that possibility exists today with the rise of China, particularly with their rather strident demands for respect. Do you see that as a possibility?
Yes, and the only way to prevent it, and I write about Taiwan, is in some ways our future is there in Taiwan. It is a democratic country. It's proof that the Chinese people, Chinese civilization doesn't have to end up as a despotic, totalitarian business. And China has been itching to take over Taiwan, that is where the people who lost the Civil War, the nationalists, fled to in 1949 at the end of the Civil War. And they actually had a victory, a final victory against the communists, which secured them the bolt hole in Taiwan. And China has, communist China has looked to take over Taiwan, which is right next door to them. for such a long time, and yet it to this point, although they're going to have to reassess how they protect themselves, they have to look out for themselves, as well as trading with China, as well as dealing with China. And I can't see, there doesn't have to be a war between Taiwan and China if Taiwan is strong enough. It's funny because I think a lot of wars occur when one side feels it can get away with it, when it feels the risk is worth it, as happened at the start of World War One, the start of World War Two. And so the challenge, I think there's less chance of a war if we face up to the possibility of it, and what we need to do to prevent it and make it really not worth taking us on. Now that's going to be difficult because, as you have expressed, your economy determines your to some degree your foreign policy and your what you can put into your military. But if our manufacturing industry is gutted and we don't have a manufacturing industry, and if we have tertiary institutions that create the new generation of thinkers and commentators who are crying out for money from Beijing, we've got some problems. And I certainly believe we need a new kind of enlightened patriotism. Thought that for a long time, where we look after ourselves first before we can help anyone else. That's how I see it.
Yes, and there are many that share that view. But for those who may be uncertain as to whether China will perceive the risk is worth it in different times, but I think there's a continuity of thought there, or at least there might be. If we look at the Korean War, and this is at the time, this is 1950 to 53, so during the premiership of Chairman Mao. As ill-advised as it was for MacArthur to cross the Yalu River in North Korea, that spooked the Chinese at the time. That when the Chinese entered the Korean War with very substantial forces, they prepared to accept what would be considered monumental losses on the battlefield. Hundreds of thousands of casualties and deaths, and charging down, very well-equipped, well-positioned machine gun nests that so the bodies were piled so high that that you couldn't shoot over them anymore. That sort of thing. So they're prepared to accept those sorts of losses, and given the population, they could wear down anything other than the most determined combatant, assuming it even came to any sort of land battle, which indeed it may not, but assuming that at some point boots on the ground always seem to enter into the equation, then that's one consideration. Even when we go back to the 1500s, Admiral Ho, which was the last, I guess, Chinese outreach sort of expedition, when they went around to all the Asian islands and principalities, even as far as East Africa, they were very insistent on demanding homage and respect, and woebetide those that wouldn't deliver it. And you still see that same mentality today in their dealings with Australia, for goodness sakes, and that demand for you've got to show us respect, and I see that spilling out into more small regional conflicts, or the possibility of it, at least, just in a quick slapping around, sort of, you better respect us or else, and that could be done economically or in cyberspace, or indeed more overtly in projecting power by, for example, the growing Chinese Navy and so on. So there's this continuity in the Chinese, where they are prepared to take losses. There are some exceptions. For example, the incursion into Vietnam in the late 1970s, where they were going to teach the Vietnamese to show some respect, and they ended up coming out rather badly from that, and decided that it perhaps wasn't worth the effort. So I suppose there's a limit to how far, whether or not they think they'll be embarrassed or not.
Well, that's an interesting one, Tacitus, because different people have different views of that 1979 incursion into North Vietnam, into Vietnam as it was by then, but into northern Vietnam, because some people would argue that they did exactly they achieved exactly what they wanted, which was not to occupy or take some territory, from Vietnam, but to prove to America, as they're organizing their 4 modernizations, that they were no friends of Vietnam, which had just been in a war with America for all those years. To whatever extent that is true, that gives you some idea of the duplicity of the leadership. That you would. So when I was in '79, they were really trying to suck up to America, and I was there just before they closed down the democracy wall, and they were saying all sorts of bizarre, positive things about America. But you can see they weren't really genuine about America. They were wanting to get America to open up to them, pathways to the modernization of industry, science, and all the other aspects that they wanted to improve on. So you can even take that 1979 incursion into Vietnam and see it as something that we in the West are just perhaps too stupid, too naive, too short-term orientated to work out what is going on. I mean, these people at the top of China have plenty of time to think about what they need to do, and we haven't even begun to work out what their game is. I mean, they are playing chess and we are playing checkers. And as I write in the article, someone like Kevin Rudd, who comes from a particular era in studying China, he thinks he understands them, but I don't believe he does. I believe he's being played, and he is. He's an important fellow in all these things. So we've got people talking to us, and we don't know if they really know that they are being played by people with the superior game plan. And people can criticize Trump all they like, but the discussions he has had and the movements he has had with regards to China are a little different from his predecessor. And his predecessors. I mean, he seems to have understood that for a supposedly stupid person. He seems to have understood that, put that on the agenda way before anyone else did. And he's not talking war. He's talking about America having a powerful military, so it doesn't have to have war. And he's talking about bringing jobs back to America, which is what we should be talking about in Australia. Bringing jobs back here, and that will involve us really thinking about as consumers what we buy, what we support, what we're prepared to pay for. It involve putting tariffs. In the case of America, putting tariffs on things, so it's just not worth the a transnational company's profit margin to keep making everything outside of America. I mean, if we're serious about stopping our decline, these are the things we have to consider. And my view about the West is that the light is on and no one's home, and whoever wants to take us on, whether it's the Islamic revivalists or the Sino revivalists, or in the case of Obama and Iran, the Persian revivalists, we are easy prey because we haven't worked out who we are, what we're doing here, and what we're going to do in the future. How to react to these people.
There's a lot of conversations going on, probably not in the right places, but when we look at the rise of say Japan as a case in point, or even Taiwan or Singapore and places like that, they all these, or even throughout history, the rise of Britain and Germany and so on. The British brought manufactured goods, and they could make things. If in terms of the mass market, they make things at a better quality and were cheaper than anyone else could, and so they brought something to the table that others hadn't done. The same with the rise of Germany. They brought precision engineered steel. chemicals, electrical engineering, chemical engineering. So they brought a whole lot of new things to the table. Not that they didn't use tariffs, they did. The Americans brought interchangeable parts and mass production. There was sort of something new, and Japan brought that quality control aspects of manufacturing and the robotization of certain things. And so they brought new efficiencies to the table. China is the only rising power that I can think of throughout history, or that I'm aware of, that hasn't brought anything new to the table. They've just been handed the jobs, and they've brought cheap labour through their mass peasants, rural peasants. So they've just trucked into the city to work at the factories. To my knowledge, they've brought nothing new.
Oh, well, two things there. I mentioned the bullet trains before. It's massive what they've done with the fast trains in China. And it's true, they didn't, I take your point, they didn't originate it, but they've certainly developed it. They've certainly fine-tuned it. And it makes a lot of sense in a country full of so many big cities and people traveling between one and another. But the other point is G5 might be about to change what you were just saying, that what have they brought to the table. So maybe this new generational technology, we will start to see things. But mind you, even in that, it seems like American and other technology companies are trying to give as much, have given so much research and help and technology transfer to China. So maybe what the Chinese have brought to it, you got me thinking what they have brought to capitalism, is that it can be combined with an authoritarian, despotic, totalitarian regime. Maybe they have evolved that equation where there can be things that are private companies, but there are so many connections around that private company. Who is on the board, the rules they have to obey, the help they're given from the government, and so on and so forth. That maybe China is perfecting a new kind of capitalist oligarchical collectivism, and it's not impossible that we might be following down the same path. In other words, as they might be corrupting us in their relationship with us, as we decide that universities are no longer the pursuit of truth, which I put it to you that all these Confucius institutes aren't necessarily interested in truth as we have known it, and they are interested in a brave new world. Maybe that I finally got to it. Maybe that is the communist China's contribution to capitalism, that they've managed to push it, accelerate it, act as a catalyst of taking it all into a brave new world. As I've said about WeChat, where if you're in China, everything is on WeChat. So WeChat is used for finding, communicating with people, finding a restaurant, buying a movie, paying your bank, with the face recognition technology coming out, mapping where you are. And to not be on WeChat is to be exiled from the community around you. To be on WeChat is you are just an open book to the authorities. And we know that there are 100,000 Chinese, a few of them listening to this for sure, in their cyber police force, who are out there trying to checking what everybody's doing and stealing intellectual property. And I know for a fact that I cannot put onto Facebook articles from my blog. It suddenly came up and said, someone has. I was putting some Hong Kong things on, but Hong Kong protesters, and I don't know who's now barred me from putting something from my blog straight from my blog. So in other words, I can still use Facebook, but things from my blog can no longer go onto Facebook. And who protested against me putting some pretty things about democracy in Hong Kong? So my long answer to your point is maybe this is communist China's contribution to capitalism, is to help fine-tune Oceania.
Okay, well, or a Chinese voice suddenly breaks in you. Where are your papers? Show me your papers. Yeah.
Well,
Just on that formula, coming to that point, if you look at, say, the Boxer Rebellion in 1901 in China, which led in ultimately to a military incursion from some Western powers, and you look at, say, Sun Yat-sen and his role in the formulation of what we could say was the Republic of China, which then was heavily borrowed upon by or to some extent at least by the communists. They were constantly talking about righteousness and harmony, and the way to achieve harmony and consensus and Confucian agreement was simply to eliminate those that may disagree, or to eliminate those points of view, and if ultimately the people who held them, and if you look at that, then feeding back into today's communist narrative, if you disagree with the narrative, whether it be in communist China or in a Western university like Sydney University, you can be jumped on and threatened and so on.
You might disagree with this, but I can't see the Communist Party as having any connection to Confucianism. If they have any connection, they have a connection to the Qin Code, the guy who gave us the terracotta warriors, and the whole legalist mentality, which Mao loved, by the way. He liked Emperor Qin, which is the opposite of Confucianism, which was to brutally kowtow everybody into going along with the program. And we forget that this Communist Party has borrowed its ideas from Marx and Lenin, and as you rightfully point out, with some links to the past, but I think proper Confucianism, which I respect, plays out in Taiwan, and plays out in Hong Kong, and plays out in Singapore, and there's something to be said for it. But these people that gave their country the Cultural Revolution, I don't think they're anything to do with Confucius. The respect that Confucius demanded that people have respect, and as you just described, wiping out people who coming from a different perspective is not Confucianism. So I can't see these Confucius institutes as anything other than something to do with Leninism. They've taken the worst from the West and combined it with the worst from legalism, and that is the monstrosity of the monstrous thinking of the people that run communist China. So in that sense, I don't blame Confucianism, or I think if you were a genuine Confucianist in China, you'd be in jail.
Oh, I think that the absolute purist Confucianism, I agree. Confucianism in terms of the bureaucratic requirement for harmony, and if you bastardize harmony, as for example, safe spaces in universities, it's a safe space for thoughts you don't like. So if you bastardize the word harmony, we're not harmonious because you disagree, therefore I'll kill you. For example, I'm not suggesting that. I'm proverbially sort of saying that. The other thing that's interesting is that Lee Kuan Yew, albeit in a very small city-state, so he was the Prime Minister of Singapore and the leader of Singapore for quite some time, and even after he vacated the prime ministership, was I think referred to as senior minister or minister mentor, and he was still very influential behind the scenes there. He created a new form of government that was business friendly, allowed private profit, but in terms of the social controls, still had a lot of elements of what today we would call, socialism in as much as making sure everyone was on the one pathway. One of the things about Leninism or communism generally was the way that you make it work is make sure that nobody disagrees with the path that's being taken, and then that's assumed to be representative or tantamount to acceptance and harmony and so on. Now the Singapore model, I remember the very first time I went there, it was still a bit of a swampy sort of backwater, and then going just over the years, it was almost meteoric the way that Singapore changed from being that swampy backwater into being really a first world city, which is what it is today, with a very high standard of living and per capita GDP that's the envy of many countries, including China, by the way. So that model there of a very limited, restricted, controlled democracy, and the sort of using, if you like, the Chinese diaspora in its widest sense, and I'll come back to that in a minute in the China for China. But did Lee Kuan Yew create a building block that others saw, and this is in some way a stepping stone to where China is today? The other part is Chinese nationalism, and if one looks at Chinese nationalistic utterances and even websites, they're quite bellicose and suggesting that not only is the Middle Kingdom the centre of the universe, but the wider Chinese diaspora going out across all the islands. And if you look at the Chinese traders in all, even the small islands, and the Chinese influence in states, the Islamic states, Malaysia and Indonesia as an example, the Chinese are very influential in the commercial sector. And if you look at the wider Chinese diaspora, what the Chinese appear to be saying, if I've understood this correctly, is that anywhere where our people have touched over the last 3,000 years is in fact territory we can claim as de facto our own, and that seems to be a very ambitious and very ambitious line to take.
I've got this book here. I'll just show you about your first point, which I really like. I don't know if you can see it. It's called Civility and Its Development. And so what I would say in defense of Singapore is my feelings in Singapore is, to whatever extent they're, we might not call it the full democracy, whatever people want to say, but the people are very civil. And it makes the point that in Taiwan, there's been a real growth in civility. And this person, David C. Shack, argues from really proper hardcore research in China and Taiwan that there is a lack of civility in China, which reinforces my point that we're not talking about a Confucianist society. As for the China diaspora, I mean, it's a very interesting point, because in Australia, the China diaspora, many Chinese people that live here are full-on Western, must be a greater proportion, I don't know the figure, but must be a greater proportion than the average non-Chinese are Christian, coming from Taiwan and Hong Kong and from Malaysia. And so it's not it's not clear cut that that people from China, or Chinese people in Australia or in the West, are necessarily all in favor of the regime in China, which is not to say they don't love China. I love China. I think it's so interesting. I've always thought it was fabulously interesting. And I noticed that Kevin Rudd had that same thing. He and I are the same age, of around the same time, falling in love with China and all the things from China. But to love China does not necessarily mean to love the Chinese Communist Party and its practices. And people that come and live in Australia, my experience of knowing them is they're many of them are very keen not to be connected at all with the Chinese Communist Party. So if China is hoping that all this diaspora wants to be part of a greater China empire, I think they're on the wrong track. Which is not to say that various young people who come here have not been set up by security intelligence services in China, being given a special subsidy to be here. And I'm not saying all, but we know some examples of that actually exist. So yeah, what you're saying is interesting, and I'm not disagreeing, but I'm just saying it's a complicated story. I mean, anyone who's lived in China and has come to loathe the sense of Big Brother watching, organizing, planning your life and oversharing your life would see the freedoms in the West as paradise, and not necessarily wanting to help China at all. One thing I was meaning to say is that maybe the problem for China is, which is why Trump has been able to put pressure on it, is that to some degree they have a false economy. It's built on everybody giving them what they want, which fits in with what you said before, the sort of arrogance of the Politburo. And if we all decide not to give them what they want, for whatever reasons, then their bellicosity might drop back a bit. And as to your comment about the bellicosity of the nationalism, yes, that just shows that Leninism can, even though it shouldn't, theoretically can team up with the jingoism of really, someone told me that if you live in China, it's very hard to have a real picture of how the world works. I mean, leading up to the Olympics, you're just not going to hear you're not going to understand what the rest of the world, take Tibet. You're not going to understand the problems that China has with Tibet if you've all your life you've heard that Beijing is only in Lhasa to help the Tibetans and to help them move on from their reactionary, superstitious Buddhism, and not only will you not hear a different story, you want to hear a different story, like in Tiananmen Square, which again I have seen Chinese people will make up they don't know what you're talking about, because it's not even in their interests to argue the case against what you're saying. It makes better sense for them to make out they don't know what you mean. So it is a really complicated story.
Oh, it is. I've noticed the Chinese movies and their movie industry is growing apace. Refer quite openly to the that 100 years of humiliation when the West was, as they see it, pushing them around. They very much accept that their own disunity internally was one of the main, if not the main, contributing factor, and they sort of tend to forget Western technical and military superiority, which is obviously also pivotal, but nonetheless their disunity, which was a factor, no question about it, and they quite openly state that. And the movies and the general propaganda line is that if we allow that to happen again, that disunity will cause the same outcome, and they believe there's a straight cause and effect there, whether it's through economic imperialism as they would see it, or military imperialism, or any approximation of that. So the party pitches themselves, the Politburo pitches themselves, we're the people that can prevent that disunity from occurring, and thus you should support us, and the prestige that will bring China. It seems to be almost a paranoia there that is in itself unrealistic, but may cause the Politburo to lash out ill-advisedly at some point when they perceive that disunity is possibly on the way, or the unity that they think is there, which is probably artificial to begin with, is somehow disintegrating. But in terms of the when I first started going to Asia on business as quite a young man, I couldn't believe. In fact, it was quite uncomfortable for me to be treated with the sort of the overdone and effusive respect that I was at the time. But by the mid 1990s, things were changing very quickly, and that kowtowing type thing that I was never comfortable with and tried to discourage them from was changing rather quickly. I was on a train in one Asian country, and I won't name it, but a university student had been regarding me with rather malevolent looks for some time in this train, and then he marched up to me and quite in his not that good English, but he made his point clear enough, pointing out to me that the time of the white man is over. It's now our time, and you will show us respect now, and that was rather remarkable.
Yeah, well, yeah, it's very interesting. But tell that to the people of Hong Kong who fly the old British ensign flag, the old Hong Kong flag, and who fly the American flag. And my point being that this hatred of the West doesn't do anybody any good. For whatever we've done that was harsh, there were things that were good, and however you balance that out is the West is something that everybody borrows from, and I just have friends who are from Asia who are Christian, for example, and we really connect, and we're not interested in race. We're not interested in attacking white people, and I cannot see that path of hatred for the West is going to work. I mean, it has turned around. I mean, in India, they were so annoyed that they became one of the reasons they became an ally with the Russians during the Cold War was a sort of anti-British, anti-Western feeling. But that's turned around, and wiser heads now see that it's in India's interest to associate itself with aspects of the West, and that many good things came from the West. And I would say that modern India, for example, is more Western than Gandhian in some ways, if that's not too controversial.
That looks like we've got another chat coming up there on that topic. Look, Daryl and I agreed that we'd probably spend 25 minutes, half an hour on this, and I'm looking at the time there. We're pushing an hour, and goodness me, how quickly the time's gone by. So, Daryl McCann, thank you very, very much for your time. And if everyone enjoys this, please place that in the comments, say so, because we'd like to do a follow-up story here and have a follow-up chat. So let us know if that's what you'd like, and we're more than happy to do another one. So Daryl, thanks again. Talk soon.
Bye.